Hi, everybody. Welcome. Okay.
Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ferris. I'm part of the Students for Socialism Club here at BCC, and we're a political discussion club, and we advocate for a different economic system, and we are in favor of a mass political and social movement in order to change the status quo. So the fact is that there is bigger income gap than we've ever had. There are just eight men in the world that own as much as half of the half of people living in poverty, and that's 3.6 billion people. So all these problems that we face today can be pointed towards our economic system. And I would like to invite you all to join all students and everyone here at faculty to join our club. And one of our upcoming events is International Women's Day. We have a speak out in the atrium, and it's going to be March 8th from 12:15 to 1:15. And we have a bunch of these events that around the whole semester. And if you're interested, we meet every Wednesday at college hour, 12:15 to 1:15, room 55. If you have any questions, just come up to talk to Jolene or me right here. So I want to introduce a person who's an important figure that we need more than ever. He has a PhD in economics from Yale. He's a Marxist economics professor of economic emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, author of many books on the various problems and inherent inequalities of capitalism. He has introduced a different approach to the study of economics and economic methodology, and has also extensive writing on that topic. One of his current projects is called Democracy at Work, and you can see the table in front. They have the book, which is called Democracy at Work, and they basically advocate for workers, and he's probably going to talk about it. And I encourage everyone to check out all the work that's being done. And he hosts a weekly radio show called Economic Update, same topic, and there's literature all about that. So he's here to talk about the elephant in the room. The economic elites have elected someone who's one of their own. What will it mean for us students, and what does it mean overall? That's the topic for today, and there will be a presentation and a Q&A. So please welcome Richard Wolff.
Thank you. All right, can everyone hear what I have to say? Yes? Okay, good. Well, the elephant in the room, he probably won't be happy to be called an elephant. He gets upset easily, as you've probably noticed. He's a billionaire. No one quite knows how many billions he has. He doesn't release his taxes, so you can't reason it backwards to figure out. But I thought you might be interested, in case you've never sat down with a calculator, to understand what it means if you are a billionaire, if you have $1 billion or more. But for each $1 billion you have, if you give that to the kinds of firms that there are thousands of in Wall Street who manage your money, they have different names, but the name you may have heard of is called a hedge fund. But it's not important. It's just a group of people who specialize in investing money. They get a cut of what they do with your money, but you pay them because they can do a better job of it than you do. And these days, if you have $1 billion, you give them $1 billion. By the way, they're very nice to you. They give you big presents at Christmas time, and they do remember your birthday 4 or 5 times a year. And they're very generous because you pay them a big fat fee. Anyway, they will promise to earn you 5% or better. Many of them do much better than that. But I thought you'd be interested to understand 5% of $1 billion. If you have $1 billion, you earn 5%. That's $1 million a week. That means you earn $1 million a week whether you buy a lottery ticket or not. Those kinds of people don't buy them. There's no need. They win the lottery every week. For each billion that they have, they get $1 million a week. If they have 2 billion, then they get 2 million a week, and so on. Bill Gates gets 60 or 70 million dollars a week, every week, every year. It's boring. You might not find it boring, but that's because you don't have any money. But those folks do. And as you might imagine, they look at the world somewhat differently as the millions pile up every week. They're so happy when they get the monthly statement. In the 4 weeks, they've earned all this money, using the word earn loosely. They don't do anything. They just own something. That's a big difference between them and you. I hope I'm not misrepresenting any of your situations. But it's probably the case that most of you, in order to earn money, have to do labor. Billionaires are not like you. They earn the money whether they labor or not. The money they get has nothing to do with labor. Never did. If they do labor, it's the way you might collect stamps. It's a hobby. And when you get tired of it, you put it away, but the money keeps coming in. It's the system you live in. It has a name. The name is called the capitalist system. I could spend a lot of time trying to explain that to you, but I'm not. Because I have something more urgent I need to tell you that Mr. Trump is the sign of. And it's a little bit of a shock, I know, so I'll be gentle. You live in an economic system that is dissolving. And nobody can really help you much with that other than tell you, it's difficult for you to grasp. That's not your fault. There's no way to prepare you, really, for an economic system that's dissolving. Your parents didn't expect it, so they didn't help you much to prepare for it. Not that they could have done all that much, even had they known. Economic systems usually don't advertise too clearly that it's coming, although once it begins, the signs are there. So I'm going to go through some of the signs with you and try to explain to you as best I can what it means to live in a system that's breaking down. It's going to shape every aspect of your life from now on. It already has. And so it's important for you to understand, because that's the best shot you have to try to make some of the decisions in the weeks, months, and years ahead that can get you through what's going to be a hard time, and harder than it is now. So let's start with a few signs. For hundreds, indeed thousands of years, leaders, governments that have found themselves presiding over an economic system that isn't working very well become frightened. And when they're frightened, these governments turn to steps to do things that they didn't have to do before, that weren't necessary when things weren't so bad, but now become necessary. And one of the ways you find out an economic system isn't working is when you notice governments doing things that are shocking, that are new, that are extreme, that didn't seem to be necessary 2 years or 5 years or 10 years ago. We live in an economic system that's in trouble, and one of the oldest gambits of government sitting on a troubled economy is what we call scapegoating. Finding somebody, somewhere, something to blame. Because to actually look at what's wrong, the economic system that doesn't work, is scary. Because this is the economic system we have, and if it doesn't work, what's to become of us? You know that feeling when you worry about, will there be a job for me? And if I even get a job, what kind of income am I going to have? Will I be able to have a family? Will I be able to live where I want? Will I be able to have that pizza I want 4 or 5 times a day? Well, you worry about things large and small because it's your way of grasping things are not so clear. They're not there. And one of the most popular things to scapegoats for thousands of years has been people who are a little bit different. And one easy way to define difference is people who come from someplace else. They dress a little differently, they talk a little differently, they eat a little differently, you know, they're a little different. And so it becomes really helpful to avoid facing that the economic system we live in and depend on isn't working. It isn't that, don't relax, it's them, those people. You are now living, you and I, living through a leader, Mr. Trump, who needs to distract us from an economic system that isn't working for most of us. And so he's chosen, there's no originality here, not even a little. This is very, very old. So he's decided, immigrants. Oh boy, no originality there either. And so we're going to tell stories about immigrants. Any kind of story that comes to mind to make them blameworthy, to make people actually think that the problem is immigrants, and if you kick them out, the problem will be solved. And everybody can get terribly excited about the immigrants, and yes for the immigrants, no for the immigrants, make them leave quickly, make them leave slowly, don't make them leave at all. It's an endless discussion, an endless debate, and it distracts us from our problem. Because let me assure you, as an economist, that whether the immigrants stay or go isn't going to solve our problem. For those of you who don't know, over the last several years of the Obama administration, millions of immigrants were thrown out of the United States, left. This is not new. The Democrats hoped they could get some political advantage by being tough on immigration. You may have noticed in the election that that didn't work real well for them. Having not learned the lesson, Mr. Trump is going to do it more, hoping that more might solve the problem. It won't, it can't, but it's worth a shot, just like it was for all the others. What makes a society do this? Well, before I go on, I can tell from your faces just a couple of little facts. The city in the United States that is probably home to the largest number of immigrants is New York City, where I live. Over the last 30 or 40 years, New York City has experienced two interesting phenomena going side by side. One, a huge increase in the number of immigrants living in the city. And the other phenomena, a huge decline in all statistics for crime. Let me do that again. Huge increase in immigrant population, huge decrease in crime. And the decrease in crime is mostly concentrated where the immigrants live. Oh, goodness. In other words, more immigration is less crime. Notice, Mr. Trump asserts the opposite. And if you want to believe this story and you want to be distracted, believe the opposite. But the reality is, no, it doesn't work like that. Nor is that a big problem. I did an interview this morning on KPFA, and Mitch Jeserich, who interviewed me, was interested in a phenomena all economists have known about immigration. Most immigrants who come here come in the ages of 20 to 30 years of age. Not all, but most. This has enormous economic meaning. Every society pours enormous resources into newly born people. For the first 20 years of your life, you as a human being, it's true of everyone in the room, costs the society you live in an enormous amount of money. You have to be fed. You have to be clothed. You have to be housed. Then you have to be educated. For 20 years, it costs a fortune. Only at the end of 20 years, or in your late teens, do you begin to work and to give back, in a sense. Immigrants, therefore, are an enormous subsidy to the country to which they immigrate. Because the cost of getting you ready to work has been borne by Mexico or Guatemala or Ecuador or the Middle East or wherever you come from. All the costs. And then when you're ready to give back, you come here. Oh, that's wonderful. We get the benefit of your work without the cost of getting you ready to do the work. That's a subsidy from the country you've left, which is poor and desperate, to the country at which you have arrived, which is rich and doesn't need this help. Does that sound perverse? Good, that's how capitalism works. Which is why those of us who've thought about this are pretty convinced that we can do better than that, and probably should have for a long time. Any honest discussion of immigrants would talk about the many ways they are positive to a society and the ways that they also cost. It's not a one-way story. But to listen to Mr. Trump, you're not listening to an analysis of a problem, you're listening to an advertisement. When you listen to an advertisement, they tell you the good things about what they want you to buy, and they hide everything else. You know that. A politician in this country is like an advertiser. He wants you to be distracted by immigration. So he tells you about the costs of immigration, real and imagined, and leaves out the inconvenient reality of all the benefits. Not only do immigrants come here with their productivity without having the cost of producing the productivity in them, but we have a special problem here in the United States. We didn't manage our baby making in a very orderly way, so we have a big bubble of people now becoming 65 years of age or older, and they stop working, and they therefore need their Social Security to sustain them in their old age, and that requires young people who will work and put money into the Social Security system that they don't need to take out because they're young people. Americans aren't enough to do that. So the older Americans are in fact relying on the younger ones who are disproportionately immigrants to do the work and put the money in, which makes their Social Security check possible. And don't you know that America's older people are busily thanking the immigrants in their neighborhood for making this useful contribution? Not. Any honest discussion of immigration would go through all of this so that we could think about this whole process. If I had more time, I would tell you about how the United States, as a capitalist system, is largely responsible for the immigration to take place in the first place. Capitalism, if you haven't noticed, been around for the last 300 years, has not developed the world very evenly. Western Europe, North America, and Japan are very rich. Most of the rest of the world isn't. And the places from which immigrants come are among the poorest on the planet. There's an economic system that concentrates wealth in some hands and poverty in others, just as the young man who introduced me pointed that out. Well, if you make very rich people in a few parts of the world and lots of poor people in the rest of the world, here comes a stunning reality. The people in the poor part leave and go to the place where it's rich, just like you would. How do we know that? Because your ancestors did exactly that. So isn't it brilliant then, now, when you're watching capitalism do its thing, that you get all angry at the immigrants? The sheer unoriginality of it ought to make you throw up. That the country takes it seriously when that clown says it, that's a comment on us, and we should know better. Okay, so much for that. Capitalism is a system, an economic system that is based on one key part: the enterprise, the business, the company, whatever you want to call it, the place where goods and services get produced, the place that's going to hire most of you at some point, if they haven't already, and give you a job and an income, because we organize our production of goods and services upon which we depend. The clothes you're wearing, the place where you live, the food you had for lunch, all of that is produced by enterprises, mostly. public or private, but mostly private in our economy. So we have to begin our understanding of the system we live in that way. What drives these enterprises is profit. The way they live, these enterprises, is they need to make money. And what they mean is profit. And let's be real clear so we all know what that means and have no need to be confused, because it is not complicated, friends. I know some of you, particularly those when I speak to college and university audiences, think that economics is complicated. The truth is, it isn't. It's really very simple-minded. But economists, I'm proud to say, being one, are not stupid. And if all of you knew how simple it all was, the level of respect you would have for us would shrink. We could live with that, but here comes the real problem. If it was all so simple, why are you paying us a lot of money to explain it? So it's very important for us to make it appear to be very complicated. So complicated, you need to have teachers like me who explain it to you and charge you a lot of money along the way. We learned this as economists from the lawyers. The lawyers take a simple situation. You promised to deliver 12 pounds of potatoes on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And when I opened the package, there were only 4 pounds of potatoes, so I am going to sue you. I gave you the money, you didn't give me the potatoes. You notice how complicated that was? There it is. But there are tens of thousands of pages of law governing when and how and where you can sue the poor person who did this to you. And you can't read all that stuff. It takes too long, and the language is impenetrable. So you have to hire a lawyer who's a specialist in all that literature, and it can explain to you what it all means. And when he or she is done, you realize it's the story I just told you about the 4 pounds and the 12 pounds. But you had to pay someone to do it. So we economists know that. But the truth of it is, it's really very simple. The job of every business is to make money, to make profits. Here's how profits work. You produce something, a hamburger, a software program, a toy, it doesn't matter. And you have costs. You have to pay for the inputs, and you have to pay for the labor, and you have to pay the electric bill in the building where you make the stuff, and then you sell it. And when you sell it, you charge a price, and that's the money you take in. And what you want is that the money you take in from selling the thing is more than the money you shelled out to get the thing made. It's not complicated. It's what every business has to do to make money. And if you have a profit, you can grow and you can meet your emergency needs and you can survive and you can get wealthy. But if you don't succeed, if the things you have to pay for to get the production done are more expensive than the money you can get when you charge it, then you have trouble and you go out of business and you shrink and you slink away and tell nobody the truth about what happened to you if you can avoid it. Profit. It's the driving reality. It's the thing that makes the program tick. Why is this important? Because it gives us a glimpse as to what's going wrong now. Businesses have been busy making profits. And there are 3 things they did that I want you to focus on because they're the big 3 of the last 40 years. And the last 40 years are your lifetimes, most of them, for you in the room, and they shape the situation we face today. Okay, first thing, very impressive. Starting about 40 years ago, to make money, capitalists, the employers, the people who run the businesses, just a footnote, you do know, right, that each business is run by whoever the boss is. If it's a corporation, it's a board of directors. It's about 12, 15 people. That's the average size of a board of directors. You may work in a company with 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 employees, but the board of directors is 12 to 15 people. Since most of the work in this country is done by big corporations, typically a tiny group of people, 12 to 15 folks on the board of directors, make all the decisions for the people who work there. Business enterprise in a capitalist system is not a democratic institution. If it were democratic, then all the people in it would have an equal say. One person, one vote. So, for example, if a company was going to move someplace, you, being a worker there, a janitor, a machine operator, a secretary, whatever, you would have a vote like all the other workers to decide whether or not to move production from Oakland to Shanghai, say. Or if there was to be a new technology, you'd all vote on it. Because the rule of democracy is if you're affected by a decision, you have the right to participate in making it. That's why we all have a vote for the mayor. The mayor makes decisions. We are affected by them, so we have to have a vote. We are very determined to have that vote. We seem to be determined to have the vote on the mayor, whose decisions most of us don't care that much about. But we're perfectly happy to go to work 5 days out of the week, go to work, spend all day, depend on it for the job, for the income, for everything we can do, but have absolutely no power over the boss at all. No democracy at all. Perfectly fine. It's remarkable how you get people to accept as reasonable something which 5 minutes of thought might say, gee, how did this happen? Anyway, the businesses are not bothered by what we want or think, we who do the work. The folks at the top, the board of directors, and by the way, if you ever work in a corporation that has a board of directors, pay attention to their fingernails. Very rarely dirty. Really nice nails. They go to spas because they have time to have the nice nails. You worry about your nails, they don't. They make the big decisions. You do what they tell you. Here's what they've been doing. To make more money, they came up with a really brilliant idea. You need a lot of economics for this. We could do better if we paid workers less. Then we get the same stuff produced, we sell it, we make all the money we made before, but we got more profits because the cost is lower because we pay lower wages. Wouldn't it be a good idea to pay lower wages? And these are smart folks, these boards of directors scratch their head and say, yes, good idea. How do we do that? Well, we can't go to our workers here in America and say, we have a great idea at the board of directors. Your salary is going to be cut by half. This would turn out to irritate you. They can't do that. But they came up with an interesting alternative. We're going to move to a country that's piss poor. The piss poor is a technical term in economics. It means low income, low income. A piss poor country where people are so desperate, they'll be happy with a job that pays half of what we pay you. So starting 40 years ago, American companies started leaving. First it was a few, because the Americans, being Americans, were nervous about going to a country that didn't speak English, that didn't have pizzas, lots of them. They were nervous. So it took a very adventurous capitalist to be the first one to go to Brazil or China or India. But boy, did they do well because they paid a small fraction. A few months ago, there was a march down the middle of the main street of Dhaka in Bangladesh of the workers in the factories there. And they make textiles, clothing. You're wearing it in case you don't know. And the workers there were marching, demanding a minimum wage of $100 per month. The current minimum wage is $38 a month. Now you can see why a smart capitalist, one that had been at least to Harvard or Yale, figured out I can make more money if I pay $38 a month as opposed to what I'd have to pay in Oakland or Berkeley or South San Francisco. So they left, and they were making so much money, all the other capitalists in the United States started worrying, oh, that guy's going to have a lot of profit, and he's going to be in better shape than I am. I better go too, which is why, if we had time, and I would do this, of course, I would ask all of you right now, stop what you're doing, stand up, take off all your clothes. you shouldn't be quite as excited by this as some of you clearly are. But no, don't. Uh, oh, okay. The very idea was getting him warmed up. And we would have a pile over here of the clothing that is made in the United States. That'd be a very small pile. And a pile over here of the clothing made someplace else, which, as you all know, would be a very big pile. Because it's profitable. But of course, this has consequences, this act of profit. The capitalists made a decision that's good for their profits. They left. And that means for millions of Americans, no job. The job's gone. You live in Oakland, but the job doesn't anymore. You're stuck. You have mortgage to meet. You have family. Your kids are in school. You can't go to Bangladesh even if you wanted to. And once they tell you about how folks live over there, you don't want to anymore either. The jobs are gone. But of course, there are some capitalists who can't just move. They're stuck here. For example, they are people who grow, I don't know, avocados, or kiwis, or pistachios, right? Or they have vineyards. You can't rip them up and move them to Bangladesh. Doesn't work out. The Pinot doesn't taste good. So they need to solve the problem of making more money, but they can't leave. Solution, bring the poor people here. Same game, just a different arrangement. If you can't go to where the people are poor and will work for nothing, bring the people who will work for a very little and bring them here. If you're stuck here, that's the solution. And suppose you couldn't do either of them. For whatever complicated reason, you couldn't leave and you couldn't bring immigrants in. Here's the other thing a profit-driven capitalist does. We call it in economics automation. We replace workers with robots. We replace workers with machines, computers, computer-driven machines, and so on. Because it turns out, if you get a good machine and replace enough workers, it's less money, even to buy that expensive machine, than to pay those workers their salary week after week. Guess what all these strategies have in common? They deprive people of jobs here, either because they've moved to another country, or they've replaced you with a machine, or they've brought in low-income people who will work for less than you will. In each case, it's capitalism. It's the logic of the system, the profit that drives each capitalist, the fear that each capitalist has that if they don't make a profit, they will be outcompeted by the other capitalists. You really can't get angry at the capitalists. They're trapped in this game just like the rest of us. But what they do has consequences. And in this country, for 40 years, it has had the consequence that the people who've pulled it off, who moved to China for production, who moved to Brazil, who moved to India, who brought immigrants here who worked for very little, particularly the undocumented ones, because them you can offer to pay, and at the end of the week you don't give them anything, and they still can't go to the police because they're undocumented. You can do anything you want. It's an employer's dream. Or you automate. You have a robot. Robots don't go on strike. Robots don't give you nasty comments. They don't slash your tires. They're very useful. So we've had a situation in which not only do the jobs disappear, all those jobs that capitalists used to make boasts about. We in America have the American dream. A worker who works really hard in America can make it and get a job and get an income and have a car and a vacation and a college education. Listen, we can't do that anymore. Sorry. American dream, not for you. You've been replaced by a robot, by an immigrant, or by someone working in another part of the world. And the other part of the world, they deserve their credit or blame, depending on your point of view, for playing along in this game. The leaders in China, the leaders in India, they made their people available, didn't they? Otherwise, American companies couldn't have gone there. They had to be agreeable to this arrangement, which they were, because they wanted to develop their economy, and having American companies come in there, and German and British and French and Japanese also, they could develop. And China, for example, went from a very poor, underdeveloped country to the #1 economic power after the United States in the world today. It served their purpose of industrialization pretty well, but at the cost of making a lot of their workers have to work very hard for not very much money. So the result has been to make Americans upset. When the jobs weren't here anymore, it was harder to get them. When Americans were competing with very poor people by the hundreds of millions looking for work, the standard of work in this country fell. You lost your pension, you lost your benefits, your job wasn't secure anymore. You didn't have what you had been led to expect. It was particularly painful for college students like many of you are. People who go into debt to get a degree, expecting that the degree will get them that job, which I have to tell you isn't there anymore. So you're left with a degree that doesn't get you a job and lots of debts too. You feel as though you've been betrayed and ripped off? Good, you have. That's exactly right. And if you don't feel that way, it's because you haven't paid much attention, which I can understand given what you're faced with. But it's probably better to face it. Your chances are better. So what has it meant for the American economy in the last 40 years? Well, let's go through real quickly. Topsy-turvy, bouncy economy, or what we call in economics, instability. Capitalism has always been like that. Every 4 to 7 years, by the way, for those of you that are interested in history, every 4 to 7 years, capitalism has a downturn. We have a lot of words for that. Downturn, recession, depression. There's an old joke. It's a recession if the guy next door to you is out of work. It's a depression when you're out of work. We have lots of words because it happens all the time. Wherever capitalism has come, downturn every 4 to 7 years. Sometimes they don't last very long. We're grateful. Sometimes they hit and they last a long time and they bite very deep. That's the one, 2008. That was a doozy. Second worst one in capitalism's history, the worst one back in 1929, the 1930s. This is a system that's unstable. Some of you may have heard me tell this joke. It's the best way I know how to get it across. Here we go. So remember, this is a joke. It's a clue. It's a hint. If you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. You ought to wonder why you haven't moved out of this economic system. Instability, we probably could survive. The second thing that happened the last 40 years was another problem of capitalism, inequality. But there's no mystery here. If the capitalists, the ones who make money off profit, were able to substitute low-cost workers, immigrants, foreigners, machines, for what they used to pay you, then they've made more money because the cost of producing has gone down, because they pay less. It's no mystery here. So they've done real well. The stock market in the last 30 to 40 years has boomed like never before. Been bothered by instability, yep, but it has done real well for the folks at the top, the 1%. Especially those billionaires who earn, remember, $1 million a week, whether they work or not. Now, if you have a large wealth concentrated with a few people at the top, you immediately have a political problem, especially in a country like ours where everybody votes. Because it isn't going to take very long for people who live in a country where everybody votes to figure out, let's see, the mass of people are not participating in all this wealth. So we're being screwed in the economic sense, but we have the majority of the votes. Maybe if we use the power of voting, each of us with a vote, we would have the ability to use politics to undo the results of this capitalist economy. You know how to do that. A tax. That's a one way to do it. That's fun. We are the majority. We vote for a tax. Here's how the tax would work. 94% of every dollar you earn, let's say over $100,000 a year. Every dollar you earn over $100,000 a year, 94% of it, 94 cents, go to Washington to be used, well, I'll pick something at random, to make college free for everybody. Then the people would have voted the majority to tax everybody, every dollar over 100,000, first 100,000, you're okay, but over 100,000, 94 cents goes to Uncle Sam, you get to keep 6 cents. That could happen. You know how I know it could happen? Because we already did that in the United States. That's what we did in 1944. We passed an income tax that said everybody who earns over 100,000 has to give 94 cents to Uncle Sam. That's what rich people had to do then. Let me say that again. That's what rich people had to do. One more time. That's what rich people had to do. And the money was used to help average citizens. Can you imagine? So we know this could happen because it already did. And rich people who pay more attention, they are very aware that this could happen. And so they have to take a portion of the wealth that they've concentrated in their hands over the last 40 years by using immigrants and moving production abroad and robots. They have to use a portion of that to make sure that political thing never happens again. And they do that by buying the politicians and buying the political parties and making it so expensive to run for office that nobody can. Unless you do what those people with the money want you to do, because then they'll give you the money to do it. So we have a corrupted politics. Why? Because capitalism has the profit motive that drives the people to do the things that concentrate the wealth that make them have to buy the politics. It's all very nicely connected. You're upset, perhaps, that money controls politics. You're upset, perhaps, at what's being said and done to immigrants, literally today as we speak. But the root cause of this is an economic system that makes all the people in it play in certain ways and by certain rules. Okay, so where does this go? Mr. Trump says he's going to solve this problem. What does he offer? Well, two things he seems to be concentrating on. One, he's not going to let immigrants come here, and he's going to kick out as many of those that are here as he can. So he's saying to businesses in America who've been making a fortune off of immigrant low-wage labor that they're not going to be able to do that. Then he's also saying he's going to punish the companies that went to those places to produce there and then ship the stuff back in the United States. It's going to make them pay a tax at the border on all those goods. That's going to hurt the companies that rely on low-wage immigrants, and it's going to hurt the companies that went abroad. Companies that have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in producing around the world. Mr. Trump is declaring war on huge sections of capitalist enterprises. And as you might expect, they're not thrilled. They don't like him. But Mr. Trump isn't stupid. Well, what's he going to do about this distaste of these companies? He's offering them a bribe. And this is important that you pay attention because this is going to affect you big time. Here's the bribe. To soften the blow of what I'm doing by depriving you of cheap immigrants and of cheap foreign locations for your production, I'm going to cut your taxes, and I'm going to cut the rules and regulations that limit you. You want to pollute? Go ahead. You want to dump toxic junk in the neighborhood swimming pool? Do it. Explain to the young people that blue and green and yellow water is actually very good for their sinus conditions. Why not? Cut the taxes. He proposes to cut profit rates from 35% to 15%. That's called a healthy cut. your life, every dimension of your life is about to be affected by this deal being struck by Mr. Trump and the corporations. If they let him do what he wants with immigrants and do what he wants with rules governing bringing goods back that are produced abroad for consumption here, if they let him, he will give them the tax cut and the deregulation they never dreamed they would get. That's the deal. Will that deal work? Nobody knows. That's being negotiated right now. You will not read much about it. There'll be glimpses here and there if you follow the financial press, but that's the deal. If that deal isn't made, Mr. Trump is not long for this job that he's currently in. We will all get a new installment of the famous line, "Liar, liar, Pence on fire because of Mr. Pence." That's the deal. If that deal goes through, the quality of the air and water you breathe, the literal survivability of the planet, all of that will be made much worse than it is now. And the government will be cutting every program there is because it has no money, having basically given up on the corporate sector. It will either cut social services or put taxes on all of us as workers. Those are the only options left anyway. That's what it'll do. So we're going to be watching a system solve its problems by a negotiation between a tiny group of political leaders at the top and a tiny group of businesses, while the rest of us are wondering, how will we be impacted when all of the options are horrible for us? Different sets are horrible, but that's what we got. And that's how this system works. So let me conclude by telling you where all this leads, if you haven't figured it out already. This is a system that works this way. When it runs itself into a problem, it solves it by keeping the system intact. In fact, that's the rule for solving all problems. Anything is considerable. We will look at every option so long as it doesn't change the basic system. So have we gotten inequality to a point where people are enraged with us? Yes. Have we got instability that makes people angry? Okay, let's see. We'll whack the immigrants, and we'll cut the taxes, and we'll get rid of the rules. They're solving the problem in such a way that leaves the basic economic system untouched. We still have the corporations run by the tiny minority, competing to make profits. We have the same system, which makes me very confident, for those of you that are wondering, in making the following prediction. This Trump administration isn't going to change anything basic in this society because that's what it's there for. That's its job. From distracting us about immigrants to these complex negotiations that aren't that complex, that's what we see. A system produces horrific problems and then tries to solve them in such a way that leaves the system unchanged. But because it doesn't change the system, it cannot solve the problem. You know, they already knew that back in 2008. They knew that when this capitalist system crashed in 2008, they had to do something to distract people from the failure of a system that is shown when it collapses in the middle of nothing and suddenly deprives hundreds of thousands of people, millions of jobs, of homes. So America did something very unusual. You all know that in 2008. It suddenly shifted gears and gave a black man the job of president, which nobody had thought would happen for generations here. Why? Because it made an awful lot of people think something interesting and different and new and exciting was happening. He didn't change much of anything. Now we have the other way. Shifting to the right, an old white billionaire is going to do his thing. But he, like Obama, isn't changing anything fundamental. He's going to distract us, not by the kinds of mildly progressive things Obama tried and did, but by the reactionary, conservative, right-wing things Mr. Trump proposes to do in gusto that all have the same quality. They don't change anything about the basic distribution. The billionaires are collecting their 1 million a week, every week now, just like they did throughout the Obama administration, etc. He's changing nothing fundamental. So looking for another rule or regulation or another law, it's too late, folks. We're done with that. We've been there, we've tried that. After the collapse of capitalism in the 1920s, throughout the 30s, we passed one regulation after another, one rule after another. What we never did is took the power and the authority away from the capitalists, so they went about undoing, in the last 40 years, what was done in the 1930s. If all we do now is, again, have a few rules, a few regulations, another reform or two, we will have learned nothing. The only way for decent jobs, decent incomes, to be secure for you, your generation, let alone those to come, is if we change the system. The only way you are going to have a secure job is if the jobs are no longer handed out by a tiny minority of people driven by profit, but are instead distributed by us to us for the reason we want them, namely to have a secure job, a decent income, and an ability to live in a responsible way. The argument to democratize the economy, for enterprises no longer to be run by a handful of shareholders and a handful of members of the board of directors, but to be democratically owned and operated by people who work there, that's not an argument about some abstract ideology. It is the only way to get back not just the American dream of a job, an income, and a way to live in civil society by participating in politics, by having a chance to shape the community. This is not an ideological argument. There is no other way to make that secure. That's what the last 75 years has taught us. In the 1930s, in the wake of the worst collapse of capitalism, we got a good government, we got some good laws, we got minimum wages, we got a bunch of things. But because we didn't change the system, that was taken away from us by the people who didn't want it in the first place. The very people who are now very rich and very powerful. That has to be changed, or else we won't be able to blame them for doing it to us. We will have to blame ourselves for not having understood the situation and made that change happen. To expect them to hand it over to us is naive. How many times did the masters dissolve slavery and hand it all over to the slaves? Be a tough one to find. We have to do that. And if that's scary, I understand that. I really do. But I guess what I've had to tell you today is that if we don't do it, that's scary too. And you are the generation that is facing the scariness coming home. So for you, the issue of system change is not abstract, it's not about philosophy. It's about making a decent life within the time you have. And it's doable, it just depends on whether you're willing. Your real choice is to accept the continued dissolution of this economic system, symbolized by these wild gyrations from one scapegoat to another, none of them work, or realizing what's going on, making a collective intervention to change the system and being courageous enough. Last point. For the last 50 years, roughly half a century, it has been taboo in America to talk about changing the system. For those of you that don't do much with American history, let me assure you, before that it wasn't so taboo. the first half of the 20th century and in the 19th century, there were fairly widespread conversations all through American society about changing the system. After all, we are a society that did change systems. In much of the South, we had slavery. We changed the system. One day we had a war, and in the middle of that war, one side declared the Emancipation Proclamation. A slave is no longer a slave as of today. Book. That's called changing the system quickly. Imagine a society which said an arrangement for production in which a tiny handful of people make all the decisions, whether you have a job, whether the job is here or in China, whether the job is safe or unhealthy. We're not going to allow a tiny group of people to make that decision for everybody. That's a decision that the democracy means we all have to make for ourselves collectively. For a few people to decide is as unacceptable as for one person to own another person was unacceptable to Abraham Lincoln. Of course we can do that. Will we accept to participate in a ship going down? Or are we going to take the scary step of saying, whoa, the world can do better than capitalism? It's not such a scary thought. There's a political party in Germany. I hope you've heard of it, but you probably haven't, called the Die Linke, which in Germany means the left, which gives you a clue as to where they are. Their slogan, well, they have several slogans, but one of their slogans is, Germany can do better than capitalism. That sums it up. They currently have about 9% of the vote in Germany by the polls. And in Germany, because they have proportional representation, if you get 9% of the vote, you get 9% of the representatives in the parliament. So 9% of the delegates sitting there making laws come from a party that believes capitalism is something we can do better than. The 50 years of taboo are over in the United States now. It's capitalism's collapse in 2008 that has brought back onto the consciousness of our society, which is why I can speak to you the way I am right now, that capitalism is up for grabs too. We can debate it, we can evaluate it, and we can do better. And it's shame on us if we don't. Thank you very much.
So if people have comments or questions, I'd be glad to shove the mic around.
Yes, hello. I agree with you about attitude to Mr. Trump. There's no difference. But I'm a little concerned about your attitude to change capitalism, but you never say to what. I was born in the Soviet Union, and I saw the communism of the Soviet Union for 40 years. It's enough to make some conclusions. I would never agree that that type of system is better than capitalism. People run from that system to capitalism. Also, what I didn't agree with you is a little Orwellian, based on George Orwell attitude, like the animals must take the power in the animal farm, and what will happen? We know in this animal farm story what happened. So it is probably not that simple that we people must take the power of the enterprises. It will not be a good result. There's many things that you said that I'm not really very clear. It's a little simplified for me. I wanted a little more complicated approach.
Okay.
But thank you anyways.
No, that's perfectly fair. My only plea is that if you're given 40 to 45 minutes, the level of depth you can get is limited. Let me comment though, for those of you that might be interested, one of the biggest projects of my life, a project I spent 10 years working on, 10 years of my adult life, was to try to understand from exactly the perspective of your question, what happened in the Soviet Union. and I wrote a book together with my longtime colleague Steve Resnick called Class Theory and History: Capitalism, Communism, and the Soviet Union. What happened in the Soviet Union? If you are interested in a detailed analytic from the framework that I use to make the kinds of comments I made today, then get that book. It was published in 2002. Routledge is a huge printer and an English publisher, British publisher. Class Theory and History, and you get the whole analysis. But let me be brief. Economic systems don't change overnight, and they don't change in some singular way. Capitalism tried over and over again as a system to emerge from feudalism. Sometimes it lasted for a few weeks someplace, and then it disappeared. Then it lasted for a few months, then it lasted for a few years, and it took a long time of failed experiments in how to go beyond feudalism before the conditions got together to allow there to be a general transition that became global, which is why we have capitalism today. Therefore, there is no reason to believe or to expect that the transition from capitalism to the next system is going to happen in one way the first time out, and that's it, we're done. The experiments of Russia, the Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, Cuba, Vietnam, you name it, are a variety of experiments to go beyond capitalism. Let's remember, if you've never studied it, pick up a novel by Maxim Gorky and get a feeling for what Russia was like before the revolution. Get a novel by the American Pearl Buck, and you'll get a feeling for China before the revolution, and on and on and on. You will understand that the desire to go beyond capitalism in those societies was very deep, very profound, and very widespread. They did what they thought was necessary. Some of the things they did we can learn from. Indeed, we have. And some of the things they did we have to learn not to do again, because those don't work. For example, one of the basic ideas was you take private enterprises, you don't reorganize them to give them to the people. They didn't do that. You take them over and you give them to the government. You get rid of the board of directors elected by shareholders. That's what we have. And you have board of directors that are in fact state officials, named by either the political party or the governmental apparatus to run the enterprise. What you don't do is transform the enterprise into something run by the people in it. You didn't do that. You didn't do it in Russia, you didn't do it in China, you didn't do it in Cuba, you didn't do it. In fact, the Cubans are now belatedly trying to convert an economy in which state enterprises replaced private with worker cooperatives, a very interesting and very important shift in that society for its particular reasons. Another thing that the early efforts to go beyond capitalism did was to say that capitalism is a problem of distributing goods and services by means of the market. I will give you so and so many dollars, you give me so and so many potatoes. I will give you this, you give me the exchange system for distribution. And the early anti-capitalists, the early we can do better, said, no, the way to do this is to substitute planning. Well, this is interesting. Government planning rather than markets, government enterprise rather than private enterprise. For most of the world, for the last 150 years, that's been the definition of socialism and communism. Public enterprise versus private, planning versus market. What is interesting there is that you haven't transformed the workplace. You haven't transformed the workplace, and you haven't given it, if you pardon my expression, to the workers and the communities in which those workers live to run. What an interesting idea. Maybe you should have. Maybe what's missing is something at the base of society where workers would directly control the means of production and the process of producing to give the counterweight at the base of society to the enormous power you give to the state when you make it the owner-operator of enterprises and it the planner of distribution. Maybe that was an imbalance. Maybe you have to learn from the failures of early experiments so that the next set of experiments will work better, will be more what we want, will not have the qualities that you correctly point to, making many of those who went through the first experiences say, I don't want this. Whatever capitalism is, this is not the next step as far as I'm concerned. Those are the kinds of questions that I think a rational response to capitalism's failures would make us want to pursue. The question and the answer isn't, is the Soviet Union or was the answer? No, it wasn't. It was an early experiment. They were all by themselves for a long time. They may have been able to make more efforts to be not alone. That's a debate that happened then and continues. But in point of fact, it's like the history of all other efforts to go from one system to another. It's going to take a number of people trying under different circumstances in different periods to begin to figure out what are the sets of conditions that would make this generally possible. And I think it's particularly powerful as an argument here in the United States, because we are in many ways quite advanced. We have quite an advanced industrial system. We have more going for us to help us find and implement the new system than other societies may have. And at least we have that as a basis on which to make our experiments, learning from those that have gone before us what we can do and want to replicate and what we do not want to replicate. And that's a reasonable way for all human beings to figure out what to learn from their experiences.
Okay, I want to remind people that Rick's books are for sale in the back. We have a few copies. That there's a sign up for the Students for Socialism and also for Democracy at Work. Please try to make your questions as brief as possible. And Rick, please try to make your
Yes.
answers as brief as possible.
Picking from my list of questions, I will try to make this brief. First, I'd like to ask, would you please outline some of the pros and cons of proportional representation that's being implemented in Germany? Because we do not have enough understanding of that in the United States. And then would you please also, if you have time, maybe address how we can learn from Scandinavian models of mixed economies and whether or not in our scale it could work?
Sure. On proportional representation, it's very simple. In our society, in most elections that we have, not all, by the way, but in most, if you win, if you get 50 or more % of the vote, you win and the other party loses. You get the seat, you get whatever, you win. Europe doesn't work like that. The European argument is very simple. If 40% of the people wanted something, and that's just 40%, then that should be represented not just at the time of the election, but at the time of making the laws. So if you get 40% of something, you get 40% of the seats. It's not a winner-take-all system. And by the way, we have that in the United States. In the primaries, there were a number of states, I don't know what the rules in California are, but there are many states in the United States where, for example, when Mrs. Clinton ran against Bernie Sanders, if she got 52% of the vote and he got 48%, she got 52% of the delegates from that state to the National Convention, and that's proportional representation. The city council in New York City, back in the 1940s, worked on a system of proportional representation. All of the parties ran their candidates for city council. If you got more than a certain percentage, you got one seat. If you got more than twice that, you got 2 seats. Your seats on the council were equal to your percentage in the vote. That's the way it worked. That's why in the 1940s, you could have a city council in New York City on which a black African-American Communist Party member was elected to the Benjamin Davis, for those of you who don't know. But of course, if you don't know that about your own country's history, that tells you something about our educational system. So a black communist could be a member of the board of the City Council of New York, and a very successful one, Benjamin Davis, because of proportional representation. In Europe, that's the norm. And for the Europeans, it's inconceivable to call yourself a democracy if basically you say to 40% of the people who vote for something that they will have no representation on the parliament writing the laws, even though 40% of the people want that perspective. Their answer is, why in the world would you do that? And the only answer ever come up with that I've ever heard is, this is a way for the people who are the major parties to kill off the minor parties. The Europeans don't do that. In most European countries, there are more than two parties. We in America think you only need two political parties. When you go into the supermarket or into the drugstore, you want 47 varieties of toothpaste, a green one, a blue one with yellow sprinkles, and you would be very distressed if there were only two. You want freedom of choice. But when it comes to the detail of politics, two's enough. Very strange. Scandinavia, sure, Scandinavia is a quote-unquote mixed system, but only mixed by that old definition. It's mixed in the sense you have public enterprises and private. There are private enterprises and those run by the government. And there's lots of social welfare that's done. Some people think socialism means lots of social welfare. That's why, by the way, why in parts of the United States that are very conservative, they think the Democratic Party is socialist, because it favors social welfare programs. So if you think of socialism as social welfare or as public employment, then the Scandinavians are mixed. But if your sense of what the next system is the workers themselves democratically owning and operating the enterprises, then that's not what Scandinavia is famous for. The countries in Europe that have the most developed worker cooperative sector are Spain and Italy. And if you want to see how a worker co-op economic system begins to look, those are the countries you would need to visit. The seventh largest corporation in Spain is called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. It's a family of about 200 worker co-ops who run, every one of these enterprises is run democratically by the workers in them. Okay, this is a different way of running. They have rules. These workers have passed rules. The highest salary in Mondragon cannot be more than 8.5 times the lowest salary. The range in the United States, about 300 to 1. In that corporation, it's 8.5 to 1. You all with me? You want to do away with poverty? Done. Done. What's the problem? And this is a society that doesn't have tremendous fights over redistributing income, because they solve it in a much more rational way. They don't distribute it unequally in the first place. Therefore, they don't have to fight about redistribution. It's as if you had a child with your two ice cream cones. You had two children and you bought 2 ice cream cones and you gave the 2 ice cream cones to one kid. You know what that's going to produce? Lifelong enmity. Because they're going to struggle over, then you're going to say to the one you gave the 2, be nice to your sister or your brother, give them 1. I don't want to. You can see where this is going to go. Smart move, give them each 1. In a capitalist system, why are you giving huge amounts of wealth to a few people and then hitting them with taxes and other gimmicks to try to squeeze it back? That's irrational. Don't distribute it unequally in the first place. And one of the ways to get that job done is to democratize the decision. Because workers altogether would never give a handful of people billions while everybody else can't pay their kids' college bills. They're not going to happen. So the different system that I'm talking about goes to the core of how we organize the production and distribution of goods and services, which is what economics means. Joan.
Thank you very much. You're right. Latinos and Hispanics today were the scapegoat of Mr. Trump. And I want to know how it's going to be the impact of his decisions as far as the relationship with Mexico.
You probably noticed that Mr. Trump could care less about the relationship between the United States and Mexico. It's remarkable that he would have that position. It suggests to me, which shall come as no surprise to you all, that this is a system in deep trouble. Because normally you wouldn't, why would you do that? You have a long border with this country. This is a country with a lot of troubles already. You really want to make it worse by sending millions of people back into a society that doesn't have work for them anyway? I mean, this is nuts. Even from the most narrow self-consideration of the United States, this is crazy. Why would you do that? Because you're in a lot of problems, and however crazy that is, the level of difficulty you'll have if you don't do something like this seems larger. So you scapegoat Mexico, and you will take the results. I took very seriously that little offhand remark he made that I hope some of you noticed, that in one of the conversations between Trump and the leader of Mexico, he made what was presented as a joke, that he would send the military down there, the American military down there, to help him control the drug business, or however he put it. The bad hombres, that's right, the bad hombres. Well, but as any psychiatrist would tell you, jokes, as Freud taught us, are a very important window into the mind and how it works. That joke, or whatever you want to call it, is a sign that, okay, Mexico could be the 51st state maybe, and maybe that's where things have to go, a state, a subordinate entity, and maybe that's what will be done, that you'll have some provocation there coming from either side, and that will provide an excuse to have an immense military operation that can last for decades, and the damage done to them, who cares? In this society, among these people, if it's a useful distraction, let it be that. The whole story of the relationship to Mexico since he took power is a story of an immense piece of theatrical distraction. That's what it's been. And my guess is that's what it's going to continue. And if that becomes more than that, in the sense of involving even more people, I mean, even today, the front page of the New York Times, you can see, sad people with faces covered being taken by cops into Mexico or Guatemala or wherever. This is the theater that's needed to cover this situation. In its way, it's not that different from having smart bombs and drones and being all excited about the high technology and making it a minor story that you happen to have killed 25 people who were at a wedding someplace, and it's the way this system works. If you're horrified by the costs, then my advice is understand it as signs and symbols of how serious the problems are somewhere else. It's what psychologists call displacement. You're displacing the problem that's actually here by acting over there. It's a displacement that your elbow hurts, but it's your wrist that's the problem, and you need a trained physician to explain to you why it would be that a wrist difficulty appears as a pain in your elbow. Why is the economic dysfunction of this system showing up as a crazed reorganization of the relationship to Mexico, or for that matter, of the relationship to Russia? These are adjustments to a situation that they think will help them do their job, which is to preserve this system. I think Mr. Trump understands that. That's his, to the degree that he cares at all about any of this, that he's engaged in an activity other than enhancing his own wealth, and that's an open question. But to the degree that he is, then he is seeing himself as saving the system. And again, to be fair, and I don't mean to be picking on him, Mr. Obama understood that perfectly. He was saving this system from itself. During the campaign, Hillary Clinton said that. Sometime, remember in one of the early debates with Bernie Sanders, she said, sometimes you have to help save capitalism from itself. Okay, I mean, how much more do you want? That's what they're doing.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks for your talk, Richard Wolff. A lot of questions to ask. You've brought up the solution of workers' cooperatives to move towards socialism. However, I am curious, because if cooperatives, like you say, do exist and can exist, they're still subservient to capital, the world market, and also have to compete against other capitalist producers. So, how do we move towards emancipation post capital and solve those inner contradictions within workers' cooperatives? Basically.
Good question. A worker cooperative is a reorganization of the production process, how you get goods and services produced in the enterprise, at the workplace, whatever words you want to use. It doesn't solve all the other problems of an economic system. For example, you still have to distribute resources and products, right? In order for an enterprise to work, it has to have coming into itself the inputs it needs, labor, machinery, raw materials, and so on. And when it's done producing whatever it produces, it has to have a way to distribute that product to all the consumers of it. So you have to solve, for an economic system to work, production is a key part of it, but distribution is another. The market is a distribution mechanism. It has virtues, it has flaws. The question would be, how might a revolutionized production system, worker co-ops, how might it, A, interact with an existing distribution system, like the market, with all of its rules, and how might it move to an alternative, or how might it use a combination of them? So let's take a moment. Markets have existed with every system we know of, right? Markets exist with slavery. That's what buying and selling slaves, it's a market. And you know from American slavery, where the slaves produced, for example, cotton, that this product was exchanged in markets, that how it was distributed from the American South, where the cotton plants were grown, to the consumers of cotton, who were mostly British textile producers. So slavery, as a production system, coexists with markets. Same thing with feudalism, same things with capitalism. Same things could be with worker co-ops. Worker co-ops could use a market system, and that would have virtues and flaws, good things and bad things. Now, it might be that worker co-ops would decide to dispense with markets altogether. It's fine with me. That's a decision for them to make about their distribution system. My own feeling, just personally, is that markets have, as I say, pluses and minuses. I take my cue from Aristotle and Plato. In case you're not aware of it, if you go back to Aristotle and Plato, they wrote about markets, and they were both highly critical of markets. Plato, that's why, philosopher kings, some of you remember your Plato, they were people who had nothing to do with markets, because that's why they would be pure enough to be allowed to govern. Because if you were tarnished by engagement in markets, you were considered not a reliable leader. Aristotle and Plato, however, said there were things that markets did that you might want the market to perform. And that the solution that they kind of worked out between them was that markets should always be allowed to exist if and only if they were strictly limited and strictly regulated. Now when you think about it, all societies have discovered the pros and cons of markets, because there is no place on earth, and there never was anywhere in history, a free market. When you hear the phrase free market, you are hearing a utopian dream. By the way, particularly articulated by people who claim they don't believe in utopias. A free market is a market not affected by non-market realities. There is no such, there never was. We never had that. There've always been markets, have always been regulated. Plato and Aristotle understood it. Modern American conservatives, not so much. But in any case, we might then have a rational conversation about markets. And the question, it would be framed this way. We believe in worker co-ops. We want a distribution system that is consistent with the reproduction of worker co-ops. What do we use? Do we use a market? Do we use a planning system? And if so, centralized planning, decentralized planning? How is it all done? And there are lots of models around the world of distributing goods and resources, and we will put them together in such a way
as to reproduce this worker co-op, because that's the organization of production we prefer. By the way, the current system of markets reproduces the capitalist system of production, because that's what it's for. It isn't there to service the consumer, and it's there to reproduce that particular production system, which it does a perfectly nice job of doing. A different system, market or regulated differently, would presumably work with a worker co-op based economic system.